was the biggest volcanic blast ever recorded. Nearly 200 years ago, on a remote island in Indonesia, Tambora, the country's tallest mountain, exploded, killing 120,000 people.
It's the biggest death toll in any volcanic eruption that we know of.
But that was only the beginning. An icy gloom descended on the northern hemisphere. Hundreds of thousands of people starved to death.
The people ate grass and people ate flesh from rotten horses.
How could a volcano on a small tropical island wreak havoc across the whole planet? Two experts on opposite sides of the world set out to track the killing power of Tambora. One to investigate its global impact, the mystery of the year without summer. The other to search for its lost civilization, the Pompeii of the East. Before 1815, the island of Sumbawa was a little-known trading station in the East Indies. Even today, the massive landmark that dominates it is one of the least studied volcanoes in the world. Haraldur Sigurdsson is a world-renowned volcanologist. He's the authority on Pompeii, the first to understand how its people died. Now he wants to do the same for the victims of Tambora. He's come 10,000 miles from the United States to one of the most geologically volatile places in the world. Of the 500 active volcanoes on the planet, Indonesia has 150. Tambora, once the biggest of them all, is now a gigantic shell sitting on the northern peninsula of this sparsely populated island. In 1815, when the mountain exploded, the top third of it was blown into the sky, leaving behind the world's deepest crater. Buried under these forested slopes is an untouched archaeological secret, the lost world of the people of Tambora. It's said that thousands were killed here, yet not a single body has ever been recovered. Haraldur is the first person even to search for them. For him, discovering how the people of Tambora died is crucial to understanding one of the most violent forces in nature. But it's a big mountain. Where to look? Where to dig? Haraldur is starting his search where coins predating the eruption have been found, on the volcano's western slope.
It's been 16 years since I started the planning for this expedition, and I've kept it sort of a secret, really. I knew that there was this potential here, and now the excitement, of course, is whether we're going to find this lost village of Tambora, and, well, who knows, maybe it'll become the Pompeii of the East.
But the Sumbawa Islanders weren't Tambora's only victims. For years later, people all over the planet suffered and died. Throughout the summer of 1816, frost and snow hit the northeastern United States and eastern Canada. And in Europe, from May to September, there was hard, cold, unremitting rain. Spring never came, and crops didn't grow. Starving people turned into scavengers. Was there a connection between the missing summer and a far distant eruption? Climatologist Michael Chenoweth believes that Tambora changed the world's climate. He visits London's Tate Gallery, looking at what amount to snapshots of the year 1816. These William Turner watercolors, painted around that time, suggest that 1816 was an unusual year everywhere, including England. Exceptionally red sunsets are typical after effects of a big volcanic eruption. His search for hard evidence about climate change in 1816 begins at the British Newspaper Archive. At that time, there were only a few newspapers, and they didn't cover very much of the world, mainly the United States and Europe.
This is from New England in the United States, and it's a rather extensive account of forest fires raging and severe frost at the same time. When I turn the page over, and this is a meteorological record kept by a person in Boston, which gives the information that a meteorologist would expect. Temperatures, winds, the force of the wind, general weather conditions. And here we see the freezing temperatures that killed off the crops in New England late in September, and which caused the shortest growing season that we know. And these are just two pieces in a puzzle. But weather is global, and I have to go find as many pieces of the puzzle as I can.
Michael will use his data to build worldwide weather maps. The first ever to measure the extent of the impact of the 1815 eruption. In Indonesia, Harolder has been forced to delay his search for the people who died here. Since his arrival, there's been a series of earth tremors which could signal a new eruption. No scientist has checked Tambora since he did 16 years ago. He needs to make sure the volcano isn't about to erupt again.
It's really surprising that there hasn't been a scientific team inside the caldera of Tambora. One of the major reasons for that are the logistics. It's very difficult to get up here.
The climb will take a full-scale 5-day expedition. With Harolder are geophysicist Lou Abrams and Egan Sutawajaja, a volcanologist, and no less than 25 local porters. The volcano's rim is 9,300 feet high. But before the eruption, Tambora was even taller. At more than 13,000 feet, it was the tallest mountain in Indonesia. The cause of the eruption, a chamber full of molten rock, magma, is still there, 4,000 yards below the present rim. In 1815, a movement of the earth triggered the buildup of pressure in the chamber. Tambora grew by several yards, and then exploded, sending hot ash almost 30 miles into the sky. Indonesia was once a Dutch colony, and a picture of what happened next can be found in rare first-hand reports filed in the Netherlands at the Institute of Asian Studies. Bernice de Jong-Boers has spent many hours collating them.
It is quite hard to imagine what actually happened. It was a real big disaster. We now estimate that the death toll must have been at least 120,000 people.
Rough figures from the time suggest this was probably 90% of the island's population, and local accounts are hard to find. But Bernice has located a diary from an unwitting eyewitness on another island, Java.
John Crawford was a British official stationed in Surabaya at the time, and he heard the sound of cannon fire.
Crawford assumed the noises were from some kind of naval battle.
It even became dark for 3 days in Surabaya.
On the third day, up to noon, it was pitch dark. And for 3 days I contracted all business by candlelight. The day after, ashes began to fall.
John Crawford didn't know it, but he'd witnessed the largest volcanic eruption ever recorded, and he was 400 miles away. 190 years later, Haralder and his team are nearing the source of that eruption. They'll camp near the caldera's edge and start making their descent at first light. Up here above the clouds, all warmth fades with the sun. But there's a glow of excitement in the camp. Haralder is one of the few people ever to have gone down into the caldera. The magma chamber is still there under the crater's floor, and because of the recent earthquakes, it's unclear what to expect.
Eruptions can take place on the caldera floor without anyone seeing them. And we know that happened before, twice actually, because all of a sudden you just see a new lava flow and no one has reported it. So we need to monitor those in order to establish the condition of the volcano.
First light, and Haralder and Egon reach the rim of the crater.
Wow, isn't that incredible?
The crater is 5 miles wide and 3/4 of a mile deep. The deepest volcanic crater in the world. Haralder has calculated how much mountain had to go into the atmosphere to create this great void.
The volume of magma or molten rock that came out of the volcano, well, that's a very difficult volume to comprehend. But the Vesuvius eruption of 79 AD is about 6 cubic kilometers, and the Krakatoa eruption of 1883 is about 10 cubic kilometers, while this one here is 100. So it takes the price. It is the largest volume of material erupted from a volcano in historical time.
The explosion equaled 3 million Hiroshima bombs. The caldera is looking more dangerous than it did when Haralder last went into it. But that makes it even more important that he goes down now.
Hey, Haralder, do you hear that? Look at this. Can you see it from where you are?
I can't see it, but I can hear it.
Yeah. Really watch yourself. I'm not sure what triggered that, but that's a good size one.
Never mind the rock falls. Haralder has to go down to the crater floor. It will take him half a day to get there. Half a planet away, the Swiss Alps were particularly hard hit by the appalling summer of 1816. Among the witnesses to that year's bleak conditions was Mary Shelley, one of a group of riders visiting Lord Byron on Lake Geneva. Every outdoor activity was ruined by the atrocious weather.
We should go inside, Percy.
There wasn't much for a rider to do but stay inside and write. One bitter, grisly night, Mary had a dream and wrote a ghost story giving birth to the man-made monster, Frankenstein. But how monstrous was the Swiss weather in 1816? Michael Chenoweth's research leads him to an expert on the history of climate change, Christian Pfister.
How bad was the weather that summer?
It was the coldest summer of the last 500 years. It snowed almost every week down to the valleys. And grapes did not ripen. And in autumn, potatoes had to be grabbed under the snow. They did not ripen either.
With its isolated valleys and short growing season, Switzerland was particularly vulnerable.
kinds of crops failed altogether. And this had the effect that grain prices soared. It was extremely high grain prices that were unaffordable for most of the people.
So the people, if they couldn't afford the food, they became malnourished?
They had to turn to substitutes such as grass or flesh from rotten animals. And if people ate this type of food, they became really ill, sick.
Just a glance at the size of Tambora's crater floor, all 15 square miles of it, gives an inkling of how much debris must have been blown into the atmosphere to block out the sun. Down here, Haraldur is surrounded by a wall more than 4,000 feet high. Its layers can be read like the pages of a book, each one recording a past eruption. The biggest is the top layer, the catastrophic explosion of 1815. The caldera is ringed by steaming vents, gases escaping from inside the earth. The smell of rotten eggs, sulfur dioxide, is overwhelming.
There's much more hydrothermal activity in the caldera than there was before. There is a haze from the hydrothermal vents that is now filling the interior of the caldera, a smoky cloud. So that indicates altogether that magma is probably much closer to the surface than it was here when I visited 16 years ago. It's really soft here and hot. Hope I'm not sinking into the molten mud here. Boiling underneath.
Pressure in the magma chamber is clearly building. The danger is not imminent, but it will explode again eventually. Regular monitoring should be a real priority.
So the sulfur we see here today is from the same source, from the same magma at great depth beneath this volcano as the sulfur that was emitted explosively in 1815.
Haraldur has calculated that Mount Tambora catapulted more than 200 million tons of sulfur into the atmosphere. The eruption column from the explosion would have carried this almost 30 miles high. Here, high in the stratosphere, chemicals formed minute particles called aerosols. These produced a barrier that deflected the sun's rays. It took months for the high-altitude winds to carry the aerosols from the equator right across the planet. The effect in the northern hemisphere was first noted in 1816, when the warmth of spring failed to arrive. The aerosols gradually sank through the atmosphere until they reached a level where they could be washed away by rain. The cooling lasted several years, but 1816 was the worst. The weather in North America went crazy. Among the record keepers at the time was ex-President Thomas Jefferson, who took daily thermometer readings all summer. A meticulous observer of nature, he noted a disastrous combination of drought and severe frosts. Crops wouldn't germinate. Newborn calves and lambs died, and the ones that survived couldn't be fed. In New England and Canada, many farmers were ruined. Further north, the winter ice never melted.
One account from Labrador described the change as a revolution in climate. Ships came in to bring supplies, took them days, even weeks to beat their way through the ice. It was up to 200 miles off the coast in 1860, and the ships had just tremendous trouble going in, and the people on shore were just desperate to get their annual supplies.
People even gave 1816 a name. 1800 and froze to death. Haraldur can now concentrate on finding the remains of the lost people of Tambora. Most locals have only recently settled here and have shown little interest in finding them. But Usman, a village leader, has brought the team to a gully where he found shards of pottery. This rough slope could conceal a new Pompeii.
It's been in my mind for a very long time that there was this tremendous potential here of finding the people who met this death during this catastrophic eruption. The numbers of 117,000 people killed in this eruption in the immediate vicinity are staggering, really. It's the biggest death toll in any volcanic eruption that we know of.
On this site alone, a community of around 10,000 people could be buried.
Okay.
Before any digging starts, the team needs better evidence than shards of pottery.
Okay. All right, thanks, Egan.
Using a ground-penetrating radar machine, Lou Abrams can detect buildings and rice terraces, which could lead them to human remains.
That's it. You can go faster. Hey, good data, guys.
This isn't lava covering the ground here. Tambora wasn't that kind of volcano. It was like the eruption of Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii. When it exploded, it engulfed the people below in avalanches of scalding ash, pyroclastic flows.
Pyroclastic flows are hot particle flows of ash and pumice and gases that cascade down the volcano, moving at 100 to 200 kilometers per hour and carbonizing any objects and people that would be caught in their pathway.
That's certainly not a natural slope. It looks like it got flattened out. Okay, stop right there. Okay,
then, there it is, showing on the radar.
Right there?
A structure of some kind.
Yeah, right, exactly.
A gully could be a good place to dig. Heavy rains have washed away the pyroclastic material to a depth of just a few feet, and Haralder is in luck.
There's a very large carbonized beam here, and it's clearly a beam that has been trimmed, worked by man. So it's not just any old carbonized tree log, but part of a house, almost certainly. Judging from the size of the beam, I think this is a significant structure. And just in the sand and pumice here, some fragments of glass and pottery shards that give us an indication that we're now in a site that we'll do some digging. This might be it.
At the Public Records Office in London, Michael Chenoweth has a new lead. An untapped source of globe-spanning, day-by-day weather data from the 1800s. Dispassionate, reliable, and ideal for scientific analysis. He's scouring ships' logs of the British Navy. In the very first entry, he hits the jackpot. Summer, 1816. HMS Inconstant. Every day, exactly at noon, Sir James Lucas Yeo and his first officer meet on the quarterdeck to take a sextant reading of their position. They're off the coast of West Africa, carrying out anti-slavery duties. The ship's position is carefully logged along with weather reports taken at regular intervals throughout the day and night. And almost 200 years later, the log resurfaces as an invaluable study in climate change.
At 6 heavy gales with a tremendous sea. At 9, the wind shifted suddenly around the northwest with a very heavy sea. At 9:30, the gig was washed away from the quarterdeck.
What Michael has discovered is a moving meteorological station. There are readings of the exact temperature, wind patterns, and rainfall for every part of the voyage. And the Inconstant's journey is just the start. The same thing was happening on ships sailing all over the globe. Using their logs, Michael will be the first person ever to produce a model of the weather over all the oceans in 1816, and to compare 1816 with other years.
there's a superabundance of data. It's just amazing. Every 2 to 4 hours there seem to be in this log temperature readings, and this is what I need. I mean, this is the exact year, and this ship's in the tropics, which is very good.
This program is brought to you.
It took 4 weeks of digging, but Haraldur and Egon have uncovered a whole house. They found the first proof of the lost settlement of Tambora.
Well, maybe these people were rich here.
Ornaments and jewelry are beginning to emerge. There are pots made of copper and fragments of fabrics, possibly silk. There are glass and fine porcelain, indicating that the Tambora people, rather than living in isolation, must have traded with China and India. A poignant picture is emerging of a thriving, prosperous community. Otherwise, little is known about the people who lived here. They seem to have been a distinct cultural group with their own language and way of life. It's said they made their money as horse breeders. The eruption annihilated them, leaving no one to tell their story. But 25 miles away, on the other side of the volcano, there was another culture with a few survivors, including the Raja of Sangar. He told his people's story to a British official in a document that still exists.
This is really an invaluable piece because this actually has the words of the Raja of Sangar in it. So that is the only reliable eyewitness account we have.
It was about 7 o'clock. 3 distinct columns of flame burst forth near the top of the Tambora mountain. In a short time, the whole mountain appeared like a body of liquid fire, extending itself in every direction.
It's a document that's helped Haraldur put together a picture of what happened on April 10th, 1815.
What the Raja saw was a fiery column rising above the volcano to a great height, then cascading down in 3 great streams of glowing material down the flanks of the volcano. Must have been a really terrifying sight because they were coming directly towards Sangar.
The village was almost completely destroyed. The Raja of Sangar saw people and trees and houses going into the air by whirlwinds.
We think that these whirlwind descriptions of houses being broken down and tossed around is actually the phenomenon at the very edge of the pyroclastic surge, destroying everything in its path.
Fallout from the eruption covered the island in a toxic blanket up to 10 feet deep. The few people who escaped an instant death faced a slower one by starvation. Ash swamped the shoreline, killing all life in the sea, so that even that source of food was lost. And the land was useless. There wouldn't be another rice harvest for at least 5 years. Rich or poor, in the end, it made no difference.
The family of the Raja of Sangar was badly hit. His daughter died from hunger, and if one considers that he must have been considerably wealthier than all the other people on Sumbawa, that really says something about the dearth of foodstuffs at the time.
Most of the population of Sumbawa and the islands nearby died in the apocalypse, more than in any other volcanic eruption before or since.
Most people actually fled the island by selling themselves to traders. People also sold their children for obtaining rice.
But in France, there was public anger It might have been the memory of the French Revolution just 30 years before, when direct action had had an effect. In cities, any large gathering could turn into an uprising.
People in towns are very dangerous. If they make riots, the authorities could get in trouble. The people at the peripheries were not dangerous.
200 years ago, there was no such thing as international aid or government price regulation. Instead, there was widespread profiteering. Bread became a luxury. Popular outrage spread across France, England, Germany, and Austria. In Switzerland, it wasn't until January 1817 that premature death could be officially attributed to famine. Until then, people just slipped away unnoticed. Which is why it's almost impossible to calculate the number who died directly because of the crop failures.
0 to 50 in 2.5 seconds. Top speed 70 miles per hour. They race for fun.
Haraldur and Egon, now 7 weeks into the dig, are on the verge of their most important discovery. The first gruesome evidence of how these people died.
Egon, I think these could be teeth. And a jaw fragment. So there's about 5 teeth here. Yeah. So that's resting there on. So there's a whole jaw there. Egon, we have a whole skeleton here. This is the skull.
Yeah.
And the jaw.
Yeah.
And here's here are the vertebrae. Let me just see the brush, please.
Haraldur has discovered the first human remains, undisturbed for 200 years, of the lost tribe of Tambora.
It's a very emotional thing to find the people that we know that died in this horrible manner in this devastating eruption.
Right away, the position of the body gives him a clue about what people were doing just before the eruption, how they regarded the volcano.
The people, of course, felt threatened by the eruption, but apparently not sufficiently threatened to try to flee away and escape, because they didn't know that they were going to be engulfed in a surge at 1,000 degrees centigrade in an instant.
Next to the body are 2 glass bottles that this individual may have been holding at the moment of impact. They show just how much heat was involved.
Not only is the glass broken, but it's also melted. So the surge temperature was high enough to soften and melt the glass, and we think that that was around 1,000 degrees centigrade.
To be drowned in a pyroclastic blast hot enough to melt glass, that was the fate of the first people to be affected by Tambora. But we now know the killing didn't stop there. Michael Chenoweth's trawl of the naval logs proves that. He's building a database on the state of the oceans in 1816, and for the first time ever, the tropics. That year, wind patterns seemed to produce many more hurricanes in the Atlantic. On October the 8th, the inconstant itself was caught in a violent storm. Captain Yo ordered thermometer readings every 2 hours, producing pages of measurements. Part of the abundance of data feeding into Michael's project. No one before him has produced detailed world weather maps for 1816, the year the world's climate changed.
These logbooks are full of more than just temperature data. They also have winds and weather, and they can record the weather as often as every 2 hours. So just for one day, for one ship, you're copying quite a bit of information. We see 65,000 temperature observations from the main shipping routes between England and India and China.
On Tambora, Haralder has found a second victim. From the posture, he can see how the person died, and his understanding of exactly what happened continues to take shape.
This is the second body we found in the house. It's actually just outside the house on the western side. It's a person that has probably run out of the house, seeking shelter behind the building, but being killed instantly in the pyroclastic surge. And what we have here is a body that is intensively carbonized, much more so than I've seen in any eruption that I've studied, for example, in Pompeii. This is part of the skull, only fragments remain. Then we have part of the rib cage here. You can see the ribs on this side, on the spinal column here, as well as on this side, the spinal column. And finally we have remains or parts of the leg bones that remain here, as well as in the carbonized surge deposit right here.
Instantly carbonized human bodies. The temperatures inside these pyroclastic avalanches reached about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Haralder's experience at Pompeii and other sites tell him that these people were subjected to more heat more quickly than in any other volcanic eruption ever.
The findings here in Tambora village remind me a great deal of what I've seen in Pompeii. The mode of death of the people is virtually identical, except here the temperature was much higher than the temperature of the pyroclastic surges in Pompeii.
This site is the first monument to the people of Tambora.
We have to keep reminding ourselves that we're just looking at one house in an entire village, a village that may have had a population of between 6,000 and 10,000 people, and a village that probably had the household of the Raja or the king of Tambora. And the king of Tambora almost certainly lived in a palace. That palace still remains to be discovered here in the volcanic deposits.
Now he can tell how the people and their king responded when the volcano struck, and how they died.
Can I talk to you first?
Here in the kitchen, there was a person at the time of the eruption, probably a woman who was maybe cooking a meal, and she was caught in the pyroclastic surge and thrown backward and immediately killed here amongst a variety of tools that you find in the kitchen. At the same time, another person, perhaps her husband, ran outside, out of the house, seeking shelter on the west side, downstream from the pyroclastic surge, and we find that body right here in the shelter of the house, but again, totally carbonized and killed instantly in the pyroclastic surge.
Before 1815, Tambora had been snorting and snarling for several years. So on April the 5th, when the mountain first erupted, the Tambora people probably carried on as usual. Even when ash started falling, it didn't strike them as a reason to leave home. Then, 5 days later, a much larger explosion, with an eruption column nearly 30 miles high, the highest ever known. The people had just 4 more hours to live.
People were probably wondering, are things going to get better or are they going to get worse? Well, they found out around 10 p.m. on the 10th of April, when the style of the eruption dramatically changed.
The giant column of smoke and ash collapsed. Pyroclastic surges raced down the mountainside, traveling at 100 miles an hour. disaster resonated across the globe. The worldwide repercussions are now much clearer, thanks to Michael Chenoweth's discovery of the ship's logs. For the first time, he can see exactly how much temperatures dropped across the planet, and precisely where in the world the cooling was most severe. He's found out that the average global temperature dropped by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. In some places, though, the drop was much more dramatic.
The summer of 1816 produced temperature departures from normal as large as 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Switzerland was near the core, but it happened in a great arc from Ireland through England, across Benelux, and southeast from there.
The blue areas show where the cooling was most severe. For the first time, we see that Tambora affected the oceans and the tropics, as well as Europe and North America. Much of the world experienced climate change.
It was just colder than you'd ever see it. I mean, the temperatures in parts of Europe and particularly in Canada are just well below anything we have in the modern record. I mean, they just shatter the records. There's nothing we see in the modern data that matches up with it.
At a time of global warming, Michael's research will have an impact. It will help climatologists calculate how much change is caused by natural events and how much by mankind. And to historians, it's now also clear that human history isn't just about politics.
I think that in the 21st century, relationships between humans and nature will become a very important topic of history.
One other point comes out of Haralder's revelations about Tambora. That wasn't the first time the volcano erupted, and it won't be the last.
I feel really humbled by being in the presence of these remains, and it reminds me how small we are when we're next to violent forces of nature. And we're here in our lifetime in an instant, but the volcano is going to go on for millions of years and erupt again and again and again with devastating results.
In 2003, strange things began happening in America's most famous national park. The tallest